I just didn't want to show up. All right, Trish, why don't we begin?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy May Day. Thanks for coming today to our May Day webinar. I'm Patricia. I work for Metro, the regional transit agency, and I'm a member of the Progressive Labor Party, the PLP. This webinar was put together by members of a PLP-led study group. The PLP is an international communist organization. We believe we need a revolution to rid the world of capitalism and exploitation and replace it with a communist, anti-racist, working class government that will do away with all forms of inequality, end the wage system, and achieve equality for all working class people across the globe. As if racist police brutality, war, and poverty weren't enough, the current coronavirus crisis lays bare the inequalities of this economic system we live under. The structural racism of US capitalism laid the foundation for a dramatically more severe impact of COVID-19 on African Americans. As horrific as this virus is, it's nevertheless created an opportunity for us to win more people to a militant anti-capitalist commitment. We are at a critical time in global history. There's growing inter-imperialist rivalry with the Chinese capitalists. There's a looming economic crisis of depression-level proportions, and disastrous climate change continues with no abatement in sight. Democratic Party politicians like Biden, Bernie, and Warren are incapable of addressing these issues because they're committed to capitalism, the source of these problems. We must instead build an organization capable of fighting for the egalitarian, collective world we want, a world free of racism, sexism, and exploitation. The history of the working class is one of struggle against exploitation and oppression of all forms, and we must seize this opportunity to build that struggle. Today, we're going to hear about the history of May Day as an international revolutionary communist holiday, the role of the Progressive Labor Party in reviving May Day in the United States, the experiences of May Day in South Africa, and some of the key struggles we are facing today. We're going to end with an open discussion and a question and answer period, and an overview of upcoming events, including additional PLP May Day events on May 1st. Thanks for coming, and here's Ben with the history of May Day.
Good afternoon. May Day is the International Working Class holiday. May Day is celebrated across all borders and nations, but it has its roots in the US labor movement of the 19th century. While the 8-hour working day is considered standard in the US today, although many workers work far more than that now, 13 or 16-hour workdays were common in factories in the 19th century. The 8-hour standard, like many labor standards, was gained through intense struggle, and blood was literally spilled over it. In the 1880s, Chicago workers were at the forefront of the fight for the 8-hour workday, and called for a general strike on May 1st of 1886, which brought the city of Chicago to a standstill. On May 3rd, police murdered 6 strikers at a rally, sparking a massive demonstration at Haymarket Square. During that demonstration, a bomb was thrown, killing several workers and 1 police officer, reportedly thrown by an anarchist, likely thrown by a police agent. But regardless of who threw the bomb, the police used this explosion as an excuse to begin beating and shooting the workers gathered there, killing several more and injuring hundreds. 4 organizers of the rally were arrested and sentenced to execution for the rally. These were the lengths to which the bosses in Chicago were willing to go to when their profits were threatened by a demand as simple as an 8-hour workday. At the gallows, with a noose tied around his neck, one of the organizers, August Spies, said, "There will come a time when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." At the Second International Congress, when an American delegate spoke on the struggle in Chicago over the 8-hour workday, the communist leaders agreed to declare a worldwide demonstration to show solidarity throughout the entire international working class for May 1st of 1890. When the US was attempting to distance itself from communism and leftist politics, it went as far as to make Labor Day a national holiday in an attempt to draw workers away from celebrating an explicitly anti-capitalist holiday. Today, May Day is celebrated around the US and all over the world as workers protest against mass incarceration, police murder, racism, sexism, climate change, and imperialist war, all maladies of a capitalist society pushed forward by exploitation and profits. Frederick Engels, who was present at the Second International Congress, said when they declared the holiday, "As I write these lines, the proletariat of Europe and America is holding a review of its forces. It is mobilized for the first time as one army under one flag and fighting for one immediate aim, an 8-hour workday." Now I'm going to pass it over to Ross.
World War I was an inter-imperialist war fought by the workers for the capitalists of their respective nations. These wars are a trend under capitalism because capitalists need to break down trade barriers to grow. As communists, we stand for the universal ideal, internationalism, and against these wars. Berlin and New York had massive protests on May Day of 1916 against World War I. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg with the Spartacus League spoke at the Berlin protests. They were sent to prison for sedition. This was a common practice worldwide and happened to many other activists, including Eugene Debs in the US. You could literally be thrown in jail for speaking out against war. On May Day of 1917, the Spartacus League spurred major strikes throughout the Rhineland and the Krupp factory in Essen. In Russia, the provisional government was still at war, and people struck in St. Petersburg. The factories were completely empty. In the USSR, in 1918, they had a massive May Day celebrating the communist victory in the Russian Revolution. Next slide. This photo symbolizes the defeat of fascism and the strength of workers under communist ideology. This photo was taken on May Day 1945 and is the Soviets planting the sickle and hammer on the Reichstag. Next slide. It was the communists who won World War II. It was the Soviets who defeated the Nazis. While there were minor battles in the West that we hear about ad nauseum, such as Normandy, the bulk of the war in Europe was fought on the Eastern Front, with 80% of the Nazis dying in the East. The battles in the East were significantly larger because the Nazis wanted to commit genocide there. Kursk was the largest tank battle known to man, and millions died in the siege of Leningrad and Stalingrad. As a result of Bolshevik leadership, they industrialized the nation in time for World War II. The Soviets were the fastest ever to industrialize. What took the imperialist West 50 to 100 plus years to industrialize, the Soviets did in less than 15. This was because of Bolshevik planning. They knew that they would be eventually attacked. Fascism is raising its ugly head again. Only a revolutionary communist-led party will destroy fascism once more. Next slide. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was a radical movement to attack the capitalist bureaucrats and to replicate the workers' democracy in the Paris Commune. The Cultural Revolution started in May of 1966, Tiananmen Square, with large rallies, and was one of the largest gatherings in human history, all to fight against the capitalist roaders and for communism. There were around the world, there were various events spurred by this. There were strikes and riots in Hong Kong against the British imperialists during the occupation in May of 1967, inspired by the Cultural Revolution. In France, Charles de Gaulle, the French president, fled the country because of the intensity of the strikes and riots that started in May of 1968, Paris. Next slide. An important element of the Cultural Revolution was the empowerment of women. This meant allowing women to do industrial work and men sharing in domestic labor. Often labor was rotated. Next slide. This was a demonstration in May of 1966, the initiation of the Cultural Revolution. There were 11 million workers who were all out to demonstrate their commitment to communism. Well, that's my part. And next up is Comrade Philip.
Thanks, Ross. So continuing on the international impact of Mayday, I want to talk about Mayday in South Africa and the history there. I'll cover several important Maydays in South Africa and how it impacted the labor movement there. Next slide. The labor movement in South Africa had a racist start. The first Mayday that I want to cover was in 1910, and it was organized by the South African Labour Party. For this Mayday celebration, they wanted to invite Tom Mann, a British socialist, to kind of celebrate the achievements of the party. But instead, Tom Mann actually heavily criticized the South African Labour Party for not organizing African workers. Despite experiencing a lot of growth, the South African Labour Party only organized urban, white, English-speaking workers in South Africa, which only accounted for about 20% of the population. And they didn't listen to Tom Mann originally. Next slide. With the advent of World War I, the South African Labour Party had a split between the pro-war members and anti-war members. Eventually, the anti-war members were ousted, and they eventually formed the South African Communist Party in 1921. They held May Day celebrations annually, but it was still really a white labor affair. It wasn't until 1928, when the Communist International got involved, that the South African Communist Party actually organized Black workers in South Africa. And so May Day 1928 in South Africa was actually the first one that included African workers on a large scale. Next slide. So for a brief segue, this actually happened to this Communist Party in the US as well. The Communist International was really concerned with Black workers in the US South and viewed them as an oppressed nation. However, the US Communist Party still was acting really passive towards issues that affected Black workers. And again, it wasn't until 1928 that the CPUSA actually started fighting for Black workers, taking on the fight against lynchings, disenfranchisement, and Jim Crow. And this commitment by the Communist Party in the US actually grew until it was a large contributor to the civil rights movement. But back to South Africa, next slide. Between 1928 and 1950, the South African Communist Party contributed hugely to the anti-apartheid movement. But by 1950, the national government enacted the Suppression of Communism Act. This act formally banned the Communist Party and anybody believing in communism, but it defined communism really broadly to include any action aimed at achieving economic, social, or political change by increasing disturbance or disorder, or by increasing hostility between European and non-European races. Because of this definition, it was used to gag not only communist activists, but also anti-apartheid and general government critics. So on May Day 1950, this Communist Party called for a general strike to protest the new act. And the violent police reaction actually resulted in 18 deaths across Soweto. Because the act wasn't repealed, and because of the act, the Communist Party had to dissolve, and many members started organizing under the African National Congress. Because of the dissolvement of the Communist Party, a new organization became kind of the center of the labor movement in South Africa, and that was the Congress of South African Trade Unions. The next slide. So fast forward to 1986, and the trade union organization used the centennial anniversary of May Day, 100 years since the Haymarket Square massacre, to kind of call for general strike in South Africa and call for the recognition of May Day as a national holiday. This strike was largely successful, and more than 1.5 million people observed the call and took to the streets. However, it wasn't until after apartheid in 1995 that May Day was actually recognized as a national holiday. So these were some of the important May Day events in South African history. You can see how the labor movement developed from a racist apartheid policies to demonstrating a deep commitment to anti-racist and revolutionary organizing. The labor movement in South Africa was able to utilize direct action tactics, such as May Day, to help the anti-apartheid movement. Next slide. But for labor organizing today in South Africa, because of the alliance between the Communist Party, the trade unions, and the African National Congress, there wasn't really any policies that directly challenged capitalism. Large labor reforms appeared from 1995 to 2002, but since then, organized labor has largely fell in power in the nation. So the Communist Party was able to, demonstrate its commitment to anti-racism, but it didn't really divest from an idea of reform as a successful tool to fight capitalism. Next slide. So now I want to pivot slightly to talking about May Day in the US, and particularly how it's used by communists to kind of demonstrate their commitment to anti-racism. Next slide. And so I want to specifically touch on the Scottsboro case. So in 1931, Alabama falsely charged 9 Black boys with the rape of 2 white women. While the NAACP shied away from the case publicly and generally shied away from rape cases between Black men and white women, the US Communist Party actually used direct actions to raise the profile of the case and tie it to international struggles, kind of pushing the public to kind of oppose racism and Jim Crow during this time. It was the Communist Party that actually defended the Scottsboro boys legally, and it took about 20 years to kind of secure their release. During this time, May Day's demonstrations were pivotal in kind of raising funds for the legal defense and keeping the case in the public consciousness. For example, a May Day procession, like you can see in the image, in 1934, the 5 of the 8 mothers of the Scottsboro boys actually rode through a May Day parade, demanding the unconditional release of their sons. Yeah, and so that's all I have to touch on. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Neil to talk about the PLP fight in Boston.
Well, hi, can people hear me? Okay. Yes. Wait, all right. Not yet. Okay, I'm good. All right, I'm rolling. Hi, everybody. Hope you're staying safe in these Rona times. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of May Day here in the United States, and especially the May Day 1975. Basically, what happened was that the U.S. observed May Day, as did most of the world, until the McCarthy period in the 1950s. And then the Communist Party USA retreated and stopped holding May Day. When Progressive Labor Party originated, we started May Day up again as a public demonstration in the U.S., and we starting in 1971. Most of our May Day marches are celebrations of the working class and celebration of our struggles, and they're usually peaceful and in that celebratory spirit. But in 1975, we decided that May Day had to be far more militant than that. In the early 70s, during the movement to integrate the schools in South Boston, they were busing African-American school children into the previously all-white schools of South Boston. A fascist group organized by local politicians, especially Louise Day Hicks, calling itself ROAR, would attack the school buses, stone the school buses with the small children on them. Encouraged by their successes there, they decided to to make South Boston totally white. So they attacked any one that was not white that went to the South Boston beaches, anyone on the street. They climbed onto buses and attacked bus drivers who were driving their routes, black bus drivers in South Boston. They went to integrated union meetings and attacked the meetings and broke them up. So they were in many ways the tip of the spear for the racist movement in the US, an attempt to hit back at the gains that have been made in the modern civil rights movement. So we decided, the Progressive Labor Party decided we would have our May Day March in South Boston itself and take the battle right to them. We had volunteers organized. We volunteers showed up with weapons. We knew we'd have to fight our way through South Boston. What the racists did, they knew we were coming, and they had spent the morning drinking beer at the police station not far from our rally point. And about 60 of them started marching toward the rally point in the morning before most of our buses had arrived. We eventually had over 2,500 people in the march, but they very wisely for them started to attack us much earlier. And when there were only about 100 of us there, 20 of us had volunteered to fight. That wasn't enough of an edge for them. So they had the Boston Police Department come down to our ranks and literally search us and take away all of our weapons. We had homemade blackjacks, walking sticks, things like that. The police department came and took those weapons away. We heard from our scouts that the racists were on the march toward us. I think their plan was a simple one. If they could take our rally point from us, then as each bus pulled in full of May Day marchers, they could attack the bus and drive people away. So we decided instead to take the fight to them. So we literally ran up the hill at them and met them at the top of a small hill between the two groups. Our volunteers were about 50% black, 50% white. And there were about 20 of us, about 60 of them. They were so freaked out to see us running up a hill in order to fight them that most of them chickened out. About 6 or 7 of them came forward to fight. As a result, we had the advantage and we were hurting them. Even though they had baseball bats and hockey sticks, things like that, nonetheless, we had about a 3-to-1 advantage in terms of who was willing to fight. When the police, who were leaning against their police cars watching, saw that we were winning the fight, they waded in from behind us and started clubbing our members. Sent 4 of us to the hospital. We, of course, injured quite a few of these racists, and they coincidentally showed up at the same emergency room where we had taken our hurt members. When they realized we were there, they quickly left. They did not want to get beaten up yet again, I guess, in the ER. We went on to have a very successful march through the heart of South Boston, which encouraged everyone in South Boston that was anti-racist. We then had a project that entire summer. We sent volunteers into South Boston and organized against these racists. And by the end of the summer, when school opened again, it opened peacefully. And this organization, ROAR, basically withered away. They lost their support. A handful of their activists went on to join the Ku Klux Klan. But as an organization in Boston, they were destroyed. So this was an unusual May Day in that it was had its moments of violence, but it was an especially inspiring one. And I think that it pointed out to people everywhere that if you want to make any progress whatsoever on any issue that is negatively impacting the working class, first tackle racism. You have to defeat racism in order to make any progress. And I'm very proud of Progressive Labor Party because we've always said that, and we've always lived by that. And each of our May Day marches is dedicated to that anti-racist struggle and the long range struggle of eventual equality and eventual communist society. So I'll stop there and hand it on. Thanks.
All right. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you to Neil for sharing his experiences, actually being a part of this historic day. Unfortunately, as we all know, none of us are going to be able to march in the streets this coming week for May Day because of a very, very obvious reason. And I will be contextualizing really the issues of the day, specifically the coronavirus pandemic, really in the context of the goals of our movement. Excuse me. Next slide. Pick a couple more. So those are more May Day marches that have happened, which unfortunately we won't be able to participate in right now. So obviously it is difficult for us to be able to predict what the death toll of this pandemic is going to be overall, because there are so many variables, timing of lockdowns, when a vaccine may be developed. But so far in America, we are definitely on track to have more than 60,000 deaths by May Day, which would mean that in 2 months, we have more deaths than we did in 15 years of the Vietnam War, 3 years of the Korean War, and 2 years of World War I combat. And because of structural racism, disproportionately, these deaths are going to be Black Americans and lower income people. Unemployment is already shooting up. It's estimated to be at least 15%, but the Fed has estimated up to 32% unemployment that we reach as a result of this. 26 million people have already applied for unemployment benefits, which in a country like America, where employment and healthcare are directly tied, that means that millions more people and their families don't have insurance suddenly within a pandemic. Now, of course, insurance companies are faring very well, profiting massively off of not having to pay for elective procedures, which aren't happening. Meanwhile, people are going to die at higher rates because they're not getting the regular medical care that they would normally be able to get, in addition to just the regular coronavirus death toll and the other negative health effects that happen as a result of being exposed to this virus. Now, as we know, we've seen a complete lack of federal leadership. In fact, if anything, our federal leadership has been literally counterproductive. And while mutual aid and the efforts of individual people, local organizations, even local and state leadership are trying valiantly to make up for some of these issues, it cannot make up for the systemic failure that we're all witnessing. Now, throughout the world, like I said, very hard to predict the exact coronavirus death toll, but one other issue is that 265 million people are likely going to be on the edge of starvation, facing acute hunger issues this year. Normally, that number is about 130 million just because of the regular failures of our system. But that is going to double because of supply chain breakdowns, infrastructure not working as it should, and people simply not having the money now to put food on their tables. Now, countries around the world have taken very different approaches. Countries such as Vietnam and Cuba, which do have a strong tradition of socialism and communism, have been among the best at being able to deal with this pandemic because they have effectively utilized their resources to prioritize their people. They have robust healthcare systems. We even see Cuban doctors and nurses being sent to Italy because they have the highest doctor ratio per capita in the world. while countries such as the USA and the United Kingdom and many other European nations especially, who are besieged by capitalism, despite being wealthy and having the resources to be able to make sure all of their people are fed and that all of their healthcare workers have personal protective equipment, have completely failed to do that. Meanwhile, poorer countries, much of the global south, as a result of decades, if not centuries, of imperialist exploitation, simply don't have the infrastructure and the resources that they may need to try and protect their people from this pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, coronavirus is just one of 4 overlapping crises, really, that we're facing right now, as Tricia mentioned at the beginning. In addition to coronavirus, we are seeing an economic collapse. The contraction of the US economy at a regular time has ramifications for the global economy. But right now, we are really seeing every single country struggle economically because of the shutdown everywhere. A global economic depression is definitely impending. And that, in fact, intensifies the threat of an imperialist war. As US power has been waning over the last couple of decades, we've seen other imperialist powers, Russia and China really come to mind, to have been trying to vie to increase their global influence. And right now, obviously, that rhetoric has been ramped up against China specifically. Trump normally says a lot of racist things, but right now it's really reflecting the growing tensions, threatening to start a trade war, an economic war with them. And Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, releasing an ad along exactly the same lines really shows us what we're in for over the next few months. And there's always the threat of that turning into a violent conflict. And on top of it, climate change, which is the result, of course, of our use of fossil fuels, and by our, I mean industrial, wealthy nations primarily. It will hurt poor and coastal populations the most severely, as drought and famine and flooding ramp up. If we fail to deal with this issue, it will necessitate mass migrations in the next few decades of not just tens, but hundreds of millions of people. We've already seen refugees really face a lot of xenophobia. Capitalist countries have shown unwillingness to extend empathy or even really basic humanity to people fleeing war in the Middle East. And particularly countries like the United States and Hungary, which have been hijacked by right-wing governments, especially ramp up that rhetoric when these issues become more severe. So that's something that we'll also likely start to see more in the coming years. Next slide. So after all that doom and gloom, really, what do we do? The need to build a mass revolutionary party that destroys capitalism has never been greater. As we've seen, capitalism is fundamentally incapable and unwilling to allocate resources to prioritize human need over profit. And that's why this situation is really being amplified and intensified and created by capitalism. The electoral arena is a distraction. Electoralism in the United States in this election year has always been a distraction. In fact, in the United States, we officially celebrate Labor Day as a holiday in September rather than May Day, simply because they wanted to discourage radical worker solidarity. No part of our government, the Democrats nor the Republicans, prioritize the needs of the working class, so neither of them are going to do enough to combat any of these crises. So right now, we do need to be thinking about organizing and engaging with class struggle along many fronts. Rent and mortgage cancellations to weaken landlords, expansion of unemployment and temporary emergency income, which is literally necessary for survival for many people to be able to put food on the table, and pushing for workplace protections to save lives, but also to build organizing capacity, which is extremely, extremely important. This is a time more than any other where we need to be educating our family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, because we are facing a crisis of capitalism that cannot be solved humanely by capitalism. Its flaws are being laid bare in a way that is obvious, I think, even to people who aren't very politically engaged, and we should use this moment to try to make something better. And with that, I'll pass it off to Trish.
Okay,
Yeah, go ahead. You're good.
thanks. So I think that was a really great overview of some of the history of past struggles and an analysis of where we are today. And again, I think the question comes back to what Sai said, which is, what do we do? How do we approach this problem of capitalism and oppression? And I think that we have to be very serious about how to do this. And that means joining the Progressive Labor Party. We're a committed, revolutionary international party. And that's what you need to achieve any sort of structural change in our history. I think that this is the system we live under now is not the best system that humans can do, that we can provide for ourselves. So there is going to be another step, and that step has to be building a communist future. And the way to do that is to join a disciplined, committed party that will help provide the structure to organize and raise class consciousness on the job, in the community, in our families. And I think Sai hit on a really important point, which is that now is a very important time to raise class consciousness. And I think that joining the party is a way to do that. And it's the only way to do that. So if you're serious about being part of a mass movement for change, then you should join the Progressive Labor Party. And thank you all for coming. Sean is going to moderate a question and answer period. Or maybe Rod's going to. And thanks again, and happy May Day.
All right, thank you, Trish. Thank everybody for speaking. If anyone has any questions or comments, etc., you can go ahead and post them in the chat window, and we'll answer them as best we can. Rod or Mike, do you guys have any words that you want to add to this, or are we good?
No? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to thank everybody for participating in this. And like Patricia said, and Sai said, and Neil said, and other people said, the only way that we can make the type of changes that are needed in this country is to build a mass movement of the working class against capitalism. Joe Biden, obviously Donald Trump, the Democratic Party, various other social movements are not going to accomplish that goal without building a revolutionary party. A lot of people, unfortunately, look at the experiences of the old communist movement in Russia and China, and they say, well, you've tried it, it doesn't work. Why do you think it's going to be this time out? Well, we're trying to make the point that the problems that the old communist movement had of not taking on the issue of abolishing the wage system, of not making the fight against racism a strategic issue, created problems, and that we can solve those problems by dealing more effectively with those issues. So our party, the Progressive Labor Party, we've made a real effort to build a base in certain sections of the working class, which we think are strategically important to the destruction of capitalism. That includes transit workers, healthcare workers, and agricultural workers. They're key workers in maintaining and preserving this system. The capitalist system cannot survive without those groups of workers. And also, they need the military. They rely upon a military made up fundamentally of working class people to protect their power. And workers, when they begin to realize that they're only being used as tools of the bosses to perpetuate this system, as communist consciousness develop among those workers, we can transform this system. We can build an organization that can bring it down. And that is our goal. That is our objective. That is what May Day is all about. That is what building the Progressive Labor Party is all about. Thank you.
All right, so Linda was asking what will be the impact of the coronavirus on our political organization.
Well, sure.
Rod, you want to answer that?
I think the impact is kind of mixed. On the one hand, it's created a lot of difficulty in organizing because it's really tough to organize online. And it is also true that we should not be out and about in the way we usually are, because we don't want to get sick. Now, however, the thing that's happened is that a lot of people are waking up as a result of this. They're very angry about what's happening. And as a result, I think there's a lot more openness to taking on the whole system among people than there was perhaps a little bit ago. And I think that's what we need to build on. I know the police brutality has not let up at all, for example, even in the midst of this coronavirus. We just had a fellow out in Langley Park beaten down to the sidewalk, and while the cop watched him get robbed while he was lying on the sidewalk. Now, this kind of brutality and the various police murders that have happened, that combined with this impossibility of the system to really address the coronavirus, these kinds of things really make people much more open to thinking about revolutionary change, I think. I know we have to take care of the immediate things too, and I hope that everybody who's on this, the about 50 people here that are trying to figure out how to change the world, and I think we need to do that at every level, whether it's fighting police brutality, whether it's fighting at Metro around issues on the job, or whether it's in the military fighting against harassment and attacks there. But I think overall, we also have to be thinking long term. And that's why I think that the coronavirus may open the way for some of us, for some people to come and join with the revolutionary movement. So.
Okay. Rocio, if you want to come up and speak, I just invited you up. If you want to talk about what's going on in Spain, it's up to you. Okay, he's connecting. Just give him a second.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thank you so much from the Partido de los Trabajadores in Spain for the invitation. We are very glad to be here and to hear about other communist organizations around the world. Forgive me about my English because I'm trying to be as clear as possible. And about the Mayday in Spain, as I told you, this year has been difficult because of the coronavirus situation. And normally we have very large demonstrations in every cities, but this year we have nothing. So, for example, in our organization, we are trying to work through the social networks and trying to speak and tell how the worker situation is at the moment, because it's been very difficult and it's going to be very difficult after this. So that's it. We have a question for you. So if you want, I can say it now. Yeah? Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, our question is, how do you think that we, the communist parties, can arrive to the working class, and how can we hear our ideas and our messages, and how do you normally do that?
Well, our general approach is to be involved in, our party members are involved in many sort of what we call mass organizations, whether it's like labor unions or community groups or student organizations, so that we are always engaged in one form or another of class struggle. And within that framework, we try to bring a more revolutionary analysis to it. Now, a key tool for that is our newspaper, Challenge Desafío, which in English and Spanish, which we circulate very broadly, probably about I don't know, 10,000 copies or so an issue. And we use that to try to help people understand the full story of what a communist society would look like and what kind of struggles are we involved in to fight the immediate battles and also to prepare for the longer term battle to overthrow capitalism and create a communist society. So I think our main strategy is building the party within mass organizations and then strengthening the party to be able to carry out, lead many of these battles on the job, in the schools, in the military, and in the communities. That might have been a little general, but that's sort of the general strategy.
Thank you so much. We agree with you totally.
All right.
So that's it. Thank you so much, comrades.
All right.
All right.
I mean, one thing we've also tried to do is like develop what we call concentrations. For example, we have a concentration in transit work in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. Then we have also concentrations among teachers in Chicago and in New York and in Brooklyn. So the idea of trying to pick particular areas where workers who play a strategic role in the economy could be effective in building a base for communism. So transit workers, teachers, healthcare workers, those are important workers that we see working with to advance our ideas and build the party.
So we had one other question about how the pandemic would have been handled a little bit differently if we were in a communist-run society. So I'm going to invite Neil back up to comment on that. Just give me 1 second.
Hey, y'all hear? Can you hear me? Okay, give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, well, you're good. You're good.
Okay, good, good. I think I've been drafted for this because my wife is a physician and one of my daughters is a physician. And I have another daughter that works in public health. But look, a lot of this is common sense. There is a limit to the power of any social system. If we have a successful communist revolution, we won't control the weather overnight. We won't control these pandemics overnight. We can't stop volcanoes from erupting. But the difference between our approach and that of the capitalist is our response to these inevitable challenges. Capitalism works, frankly, off of one principle and a secondary principle. The first principle, of course, is they must maximize their profit. That's the whole purpose of the system. The second principle is how can they keep control of the working class in order to keep those profits rolling in. And that's all they care about. As the song goes, don't let them fool you. They just want to rule you. Now, when something like this happens, whether it's Hurricane Katrina or this pandemic, a communist society does what's best for the working class. And if that means basically pivoting nearly the entire economy to dealing with something, shutting down, for example, all the automobile factories and instead producing tests for the coronavirus, that's what we would do. I mean, a communist does not have the ultimate purpose of making as much money as possible for his or her individual firm. A communist society's purpose is what's good for the working class. And so I think that had the workers around the world had access to decent health care so that the underlying conditions that weaken people and make them especially susceptible to dying through this virus, if instead people were simply in better shape through a healthier society and better medical care, that would be a big step. And then certainly the idea that we can't produce enough tests for everyone to be tested. Two types of tests. One, of course, to see if you actually have the virus here and now. And secondly, a test to see if you had the virus, because we know that at least 1/4 of the victims are totally asymptomatic. They show no symptoms at all. So those tests, any reasonable society would have produced more than enough of that. Furthermore, any reasonable society would have immediately pivoted and started turning out protective gear for the healthcare workers and for, in fact, everybody in society. My daughter in Chicago is had to reuses the same mask over and over again, simply because there aren't enough masks to go around. She works at the VA in Chicago. So there are, communism does not change the laws of biology, but what it does is it changes the laws of society, and it makes the impact of these horrible events much less horrible. Other people want to chime in. I feel like, was I chosen for this because I'm so old that I'm really at risk here for this virus?
That was the idea. So what's the party analysis of growing tensions between China and the U.S.? What will the party do if the United States goes to war with China over the South China Sea? So
That Rod answered that.
all right, we'll pull Rod back up. 1 second here.
Well, that's a very important question, because one of the main things going on in the world today is rivalry between imperialists, or among imperialists, because there's more than two. I think the general analysis of the world today is that the United States capitalists, that those imperialists have kind of stagnated and are losing ground relative to their competitors in the world, like China in particular. China, on the other hand, is growing very rapidly and expanding internationally. Its Belt and Road Initiative, its vast investments throughout Africa, and so on, is really demonstrating a serious rival to U.S. imperialism. And what happens when there's rivalry between imperialists is, and given that there's only so much world to go around these monsters, they end up fighting a war. And that war is not fought by the capitalists themselves. They're all safe at home in their bunkers or in their mansions, but they're fought by our children, who are drafted into the military and told to go fight a war. So the danger of major war as a result of the rivalries between the U.S. and China are quite real. Again, I'm not saying it's going to happen next year, but I think that the tension over the South China Sea is a good example of where there's tension, where there's possible attacks between the countries. They've already had some incidents between the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy in the China Sea, South China Seas, and of course the tension in Africa between the U.S. and Chinese imperialists is growing as well. So the question is, what do we do? Well, what we do is we have this idea that we call it revolutionary defeatism. It's kind of a funny term. It's probably not that helpful, but the idea is that the capitalists who lead your country are leading you into a disaster. The best thing that can happen is for them to lose their war, because it's not a war that is in the interest of the working class. So the idea is that you would work to promote resistance to the war. You would work, and we would have people in the military to try to encourage mutinies and refusals to fight. We would encourage strikes of workers to prevent them from being able to produce war material. In other words, we would do everything we could to defeat our own bosses. And we would hope and expect that the same thing would be going on with workers in other countries. I think, back in the presentation, we remember that you had that discussion about World War I, where French and German and British workers were slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions, fighting each other. And they actually, there's a famous Christmas truce where in, I guess it was 1914, the German and British fighters came out of their respective lines and played a soccer game on Christmas. They recognized that they had more in common with each other than they had with their bosses. Now that didn't actually end the war. It was really the Russia's revolution that helped bring that to an end. But in any event, the idea is to defeat your own boss in the war and win workers in the military to rebel against their being used in this way. And we had some experience of that during the Vietnam War, where one aspect of the Vietnam War was that GIs would refuse to fight, shoot their own officers in the back when they were, gung-ho trying to kill Vietnamese workers and soldiers. And so that contributed to the victory of the Vietnamese against U.S. imperialism. So that's a kind of a sketch of how we would approach a war with a war between imperialists.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and thank you, Rod. Thank everyone for the questions and answers. We're going to go ahead and wrap up now. So we will be following up with everybody that registered to the event with an email about what's going to be going on for future Mayday events and future PL events. So we do have one other quick little thing here. Give me 1 second.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to turn my a little bit here. Is that better? No? I'm in Baltimore, and I just would like to invite everyone for this Friday, which is the real May 1st on May Day. I don't know if our program will be quite as wonderful as the one today that you've just done. But we do have some things that you might enjoy and be inspired by. We have a new 10-minute video, a documentary of the last 3 years of May Day marches on the East Coast in New York City. We have a 2-minute beautiful dance performance dedicated to the struggle to defeat our oppressors. And we have a number of speakers. One is one of the people who helped to lead the Hopkins sit-in, demanding an end to contracts with ICE, for Hopkins not to have an armed police force of its own. And third man is slipping my mind for a minute, but she'll be speaking about those and about the history of that struggle in the past year. We also have Tawanda Jones, sister of Tyrone West, who was murdered by the police, who will be giving the history of May Day and talking about the struggle against police brutality. And we have a number of other speakers lined up and several wonderful spoken word poets. And those of you who are on the program will think the Washington Comrades will be sending you some information how you can tune in. That'll be on Facebook Live. Program today was inspiring, very well done. Thanks for putting it together. All right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Bill. So you can find the International on PLP's website. Unfortunately, switching audio streams is not as easy as it seems. So I can play it on my phone if you guys want to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's hear it. Got to end it with that.
Okay.
We could have Rod sing it.
We had a good program. Let's not ruin it.
Everything was going just great.
passion, arise, ye wretched on the earth. For justice standards and their nation, a better world and birth. No more traditions yet shall bind us, arise, slaves, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been taught we shall be whole. 'Tis the final conflict. Let each stand in his place. The international working class shall be the human race. 'Tis the final conflict. Let each stand in his place. The international working class shall be the human race. Arriba, pobres de la tierra, venieros de esclavos sin par. Insora la razón de marcha, es el fin de la opresión. El pasado hay que ser allí, ningún esclava envía a vencer. El mundo va a cambiar de base, nos dará hoy todo han de ser. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final y seamos fuertes a la internacional. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final y se hacen los juegos con valor por la internacional.
All right. All right. Thank you, guys. We're going to call this to an end. You can view this event again at the same URL that you linked to in the first place. If you want to look it over, it'll be up for a little while. We will put this up on social media and a couple other places. You can check us out on the PLP Facebook page. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate the support. We hope to talk to you soon in the future.
Everybody.
All right.